The Grounds of Islamic Law, an examination of contemporary Islamic legal reformist discourses. Legal scholars have long tried to make sense of the concept of law. It is curious that an institution so fundamental to our existence is so difficult to theorize. The intellectual debate regarding the nature of law culminated in many ways with the contributions of H.L.A. Hart and Ronald Dworkin in the 20th century. In the concept of law, Hart made a forceful argument for legal positivism, according to which laws are merely social facts without any normative force and are not driven by moral concerns. Hart's thesis centers on the concept of the rule of recognition, a rule about the validity of other rules. In Law's Empire, Ronald Dworkin rejects the positivist view, asserting persuasively that law is very much a moral project. These two opposing visions of the law have been foundational for all subsequent scholarship in the field. My article aims to explore the implications of Dworkin's non-positivist framework for contemporary Islamic legal reformist discourses. The Islamic legal tradition is a vast and diverse landscape, and it is thus unsurprising that here too we find many competing visions of the law. In the pre-modern Islamic tradition, the role of a divine lawgiver played an important role in legal debates, with conceptions of the law ranging from a morally coherent system to a divinely ordained institution without an ascertainable purpose. With the advent of modernity, Islamic legal debates have increasingly been forced to grapple with political and social developments that have upended traditional legal institutions and moral conceptions of the world. My interest in engaging with reformists stems largely from the fact that their views have become increasingly influential not only in the legal academy, but also among the general population of Muslims, for many of whom previously contested theories about the law have become unchallenged assumptions. Islamic legal reformists espouse a vision of the law in which morality is deeply intertwined with the law, which is why I find engagement with Dworkin's work to be particularly informative. The intersection of Islamic law and legal reform is a topic of great interest for legal scholars, policymakers, and laypersons alike. For scholars working within this tradition, it has become particularly fashionable to call for reform based on a purposive view of the Shari'ah. Under such an objectives-based approach, which is rooted in the pre-modern jurisprudential concept of Maqāṣid, Islamic laws must be understood and interpreted in light of broader human-centered moral principles intended by God. Such a conception of Islamic law subjects the entire system to intense moral scrutiny and assumes that modernity implies moral progress. Reference to contemporary moral values is justified by drawing on the ethos of the Quran, which broadly calls for a commitment to principles such as justice and equality. I believe that this push toward highlighting the objectives of the Sharia draws on a narrow vision of moral coherence, where the role of God as a source of moral authority is diminished. I argue that as a theory of jurisprudence, a Maqāṣid-driven approach fails to capture the essence of Islamic law because of its insufficiently coherent moral structure. While the contemporary discourse regarding Maqāṣid is quite sophisticated, it appears to be fashioned as a response to Western criticisms of Islamic legal principles. Such criticisms include the charge that Islamic law is overly reliant on hermeneutics that emphasize the literal and the trivial or extraneous aspects of exegesis. I posit that in addressing such criticisms, Islamic legal reformists have failed to challenge the presupposition that the literal should be de-emphasized. This failure with foundational textual authority and legal precedent on its own terms is an oversight that, in Dworkinian terms, veers into pragmatism. Dworkinian's law as integrity approach denies that statements of law are either the backward-looking factual reports of conventionalism or the forward-looking instrumental programs of legal pragmatism. It insists that legal claims are interpretive judgments and therefore combine backward and forward-looking elements. They interpret contemporary legal practice seen as an unfolding political narrative. Islamic legal reformists, on the other hand, are conceptualizing Islamic law in a manner that is highly skeptical of the concept of law itself, and can produce highly inconsistent results. My intervention here is to suggest that a Dworkinian understanding of the Sharia, through a modified version of the law as integrity approach, would radically sharpen the terms of the debate. At the moment, reformist Muslims base their arguments on a notion of the Sharia, whereby maslaha, or public welfare, is the primary objective behind the divine legislator's laws. This is a problematic line of argumentation, both historically and substantively. As a historical matter, jurists have considered maslaha to be an important objective of the law, but have not allowed it to override fundamental precepts of the religion. In terms of substance, a purely public welfare-oriented view of the law is highly restrictive, prone to inconsistent results, and incapable of reconciling intractable debates about what constitutes public welfare. I suggest that a modification of this logic, based on a Dworkinian framework, is warranted. Under Dworkin's model of law as integrity, propositions of law are true if they figure in or follow from the principles of justice, fairness, and procedural due process that provide the best constructive interpretation of the community's legal practice. In the Islamic legal context, I believe the principles of justice, fairness, and procedural due process cannot be understood in a vacuum without reference to a divine lawgiver. I propose an Islamic law as integrity model, which I call IIIT or ILAT, whereby propositions of law are true if they figure in or follow from the principles of justice, fairness, and procedural due process, taking into account God's explicit scriptural commands that provide the best constructive interpretation of the community's legal practice. With the addition of this emphasized portion, i.e., taking into God's explicit scriptural commands, we are able to articulate a more expansive vision of moral coherence, accounting for God as necessary in constructive interpretation. In other words, the moral authority of God, in contradistinction to the moral vision of human beings, is a more central feature of such a principles-based approach. I believe that such an adjustment would serve as a bulwark against potential forays into pragmatism. ILAT also shares Dworkin's vision of the law as a constructively interpretive endeavor. I argue that such a constructively interpretive feature allows for a more robust and compelling argument for Islamic legal reform than being wedded to a public welfare model, which is interpretive but limited by its singular focus, thereby risking pragmatism through invention of the law. Early Islamic legal writings reflected ongoing theological debates regarding the ascertainability of God's will. Legal scholars debated whether humans are capable of understanding the rationale for his laws. In the 11th century, we find the first sophisticated articulation of the notion that law is connected to a broader purpose. Al-Ghazali posited that God's purpose in revealing his law to humankind is man's maslaha, which consists of preserving 5 vital goods called the 5 necessities: religion, life, intellect, offspring, and property. According to al-Ghazali, reference to the purposes of the law could be made where traditional sources of law did not provide sufficient answers. Others in the pre-modern period further fleshed out the notion of a purposive Sharia, including al-Shatibi, a 14th century Andalusian jurist that is credited with first deploying the term Maqāṣid al-Sharīʿa, which roughly translates to objectives of the law. The modern discourse on Islamic legal reform based on a Maqāṣid approach began at the end of the 19th century, coinciding with the Western colonial domination of Islamic societies. The view of many Muslim majority countries the laws of many Muslim majority countries are an eclectic mix of European civil codes and Islam-based law. Certain rules derived from classical Islamic substantive law continue to cause consternation among reform-minded intellectuals who are devoted to their faith, but are also committed to reconciling religion with modernity. The project of legal reformists to fundamentally rethink the law is not uncontroversial, as it trends toward marginalization of the ulama. Perhaps the most prominent Muslim voice calling for such reforms is Tariq Ramadan, a Swiss philosopher who wrote Radical Reform, in which Ramadan calls for the addition of other universal higher objectives beyond the five traditionally formulated, presumably including concepts such as equality, justice, and ethical conduct. Under this vision, Islamic law should be adjusted to account for contemporary moral values, because such values will improve the lot of humankind, and this is God's ultimate intent in providing laws. Furthermore, Ramadan envisions a larger role to be played by secular knowledge as a source of law. That is to say, the realm of science and other non-religious disciplines should form part of the corpus of Islamic legal decision-making, as they also reveal much about God's intent. Central to Ramadan's thesis is the concept of maslahah. Muhammad Hashim Kamali explains that a purposive approach to the law is necessary because the changing conditions of life never cease to generate new interests. If legislation were to be confined to the values that the lawgiver has expressly decreed, the Sharia would inevitably fall short of meeting the masaleh of the community. To close the door of maslahah would be tantamount to enforcing stagnation and imposing unnecessary restrictions on the capacity of the Sharia to accommodate social change. In other words, embedded within the institution of Islamic law is a mechanism that provides tremendous flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances and contemporary moral values. The intuitive appeal of a purposive theory of Islamic law, especially for a modern Muslim grappling with the challenges of modernity, is clear. An objective-oriented notion of Islamic law, the friction that individuals may feel between what is legally permitted or prohibited versus what is deemed morally acceptable and condemnable in the modern world. Such a theory also functions as a spiritual discourse, whereby law is a reflection of a theology that is responsive to modern needs. Furthermore, it is powerful because it shares the law as integrity model's presupposition that law's constraints benefit society, not just by providing predictability or procedural fairness, or in some other instrumental way, but by securing a kind of equality among citizens that makes their community more genuine and improves its moral justification for exercising the political power it does. I seek to challenge such a theory using the Islamic law as integrity, i.e. ILAT model, under which God plays a more prominent role as a source of moral authority, and under which the moral principles that form the grounds of law are not invariably tied to considerations of public interest. The basic structure of ILAT is as follows. The interpreter determines a set of Islamic moral principles that fit the institutional legal materials and puts them in their best light. And then, using those principles, the interpreter establishes the correct legal rights and duties. Thus, ILAT encapsulates the fit and justification elements of law as integrity, with the caveat that the moral principles being extracted draw on a divine source. The institutional legal materials here refer to the Quran, Hadith, and juristic precedent. Before proceeding further, I want to briefly discuss the right answers thesis, a prominent feature of law as integrity that is even more fundamental to ILAT. Under Dworkin's framework, there's only one correct answer to any particular legal issue. This is the cornerstone of Dworkin's reply to Hart's view that discretion plays a large role in the grounds of law for difficult legal issues. Under Islamic law, God's intent is explicated by human agents. Naturally, there's a plethora of diversity in their views, including contemporary positions and outright disagreements on many issues. Islamic jurists have come to the conclusion, based on statements attributed to the Prophet, that the view of every qualified jurist is correct. In other words, legal pluralism is an embedded feature of Islamic law. At the surface level, it appears that Islamic law endorses a Hart-like defeatist perspective about the role of discretion in the law. notwithstanding the foregoing. However, all jurists acknowledge that from a substantive standpoint, there can only be one legal answer for any particular legal opinion, for any particular legal question that approximates God's will. Thus, even though a jurist's legal rule is acceptable in the earthly realm, there is a correct legal rule intended by God that the jurist may not have attained. The ILAT framework thus offers an even stronger argument that law is as integrity. The ILAT framework thus offers an even stronger argument than law as integrity for the promulgation of a single correct answer as the ultimate source of the law as a divine entity that does not have multiple competing wills, even if the interpreters of his laws use their discretion to arrive at diverse legal conclusions. Under ILAT, as under Dworkin's framework, the interpretive endeavor conveys a moral judgment regarding the law. The moral judgment being implicated, however, depends to a much greater extent on God than the contemporary moral values espoused by reformists. These moral judgments are rooted in a firmer textual and historical foundation and are shielded from the retroactively, morally universalist lens applied by Islamic legal reformists. That is to say, constructive interpretation under a theory of Islamic law as integrity provides a vision of the law that does not evaluate the adequacy of law primarily by reference to contemporary moral norms. Under Dworkin's framework, an interpretation aims to show what is interpreted in the best light possible. Here, by using the term best, Dworkin likely means something along the lines of most morally righteous based on contemporary norms. The best interpretation is often not the one intended by the drafter of the law, as subsequent political and social developments may have changed the moral calculus. Under ILAT, however, God's words carry much more moral weight, and so any explicit scriptural command cannot be easily dismantled by contemporary norms. The best interpretation chosen must be the one that shows the community's structure of institutions and decisions, its public standards as a whole, in a better light from the standpoint of Islamic political morality. That is to say, the public standards and its political morality are influenced by its religious commitments. This approach, I believe, more authentically encapsulates the grounds of Islamic law, which I do not view as driven purely or even primarily by public policy considerations. Dworkin elegantly explains that integrity is an ideal of utmost importance because we want to treat our political community as one of principle, and the citizens of a community of principle aim not simply at common principles as if uniformity were all they wanted, but the best common principles politics can find. I posit that Islamic integrity is important because the subjects of Islamic law want to treat their political community as one of Islamic principles. Such principles can be coterminous with modern morality and can be responsive to modern needs, but need not be driven by modern values. Islamic legal reformists would likely counter that their project is one of seeking the best common principles politics can find. My response here is that this presupposes a vision of the world where moral progress is a given. I do not take such a view of the world to be self-evident, as I will explain further in the example below. Because of my rejection of this presupposition that is embedded in much of Islamic legal reformist discourse, my constructive interpretation yields different results, despite my acceptance that integrity is bound to justice and fairness. Furthermore, I argue that Islamic legal reformists are misguided in using justice as one of their core guideposts for the law. As I have alluded previously, the objectives-based approach to law engages with moral principles, but it is too narrow in its focus, thus resulting in laws that are not consistent, and furthermore, that are subject to disputation about what constitutes justice. Dworkin further elaborates this criticism as follows. Justice is a matter of the correct or best theory of moral and political rights, and anyone's conception of justice is his theory imposed by his own personal convictions of what these rights actually are. I conclude that the maslaha approach reflects an obsession with justice rather than a focus on law, and thus fails to achieve the moral coherence necessary to provide a robust theory of Islamic law. Sorry, do I have time to keep going? Because I have another case study.
Maybe if more than 3-4 minutes?
About 5 more minutes.
Okay, I'm happy to grant you that.
Okay, thank you. So in this presentation, I have broadly criticized the Islamic legal reformist project for advocating legal changes based on notions of Islamic law that are incomplete and morally incoherent insofar as they do not sufficiently account for a divine lawgiver. So now I'll provide a case study. My example will be drawn from the Quran. And it specifically refers to polygamy. And so I think probably everyone in this room has, read that verse. So I'm not going to detail it here. But in the last few decades, the institution of polygamy, and especially the Quranic verse authorizing it, has come under increased scrutiny, including from within Muslim majority societies. The institution is viewed by many, especially in the West, as offensive to contemporary moral sensibilities. The notion that divine law would sanction and arguably even encourage one person to enter into multiple sexual relationships simultaneously is anathema to many. I believe that such a strong reaction in the West is partly rooted in Christian and Victorian notions of virtue and Orientalist depictions of the East, both of which still influence how people conceptualize the practice of polygamy. Even as sexual mores have radically changed in the past few decades, including rapid societal changes and the legal acceptance of same-sex marriage, polygamy has not benefited from the movement for sexual liberation. So what drives the strong reaction against polygamy? Much of the literature points to a handful of reasons. Polygamy is deemed to be discriminatory in favor of males, exploitative against females, fosters unhealthy relationships among co-wives, and disadvantages offspring that do not grow up in stable nuclear families. It would be difficult for anyone to argue that any of these criticisms is empirically untrue. For these reasons, the maslaha argument against polygamy is highly persuasive. And I have a few more, arguments that show, that the public interest argument against polygamy is quite strong. And all of these lead legal reformists to conclude that polygamy is no longer permissible because it's repugnant to our moral sensibilities. IIIT, however, would yield a different result. At the outset, IIIT would consider such an objectives-based approach to be morally incoherent because it goes against the explicit text of the Quran. Because God is a source of moral authority under IIIT's formulation, disregarding this verse would be highly unworkable except in the most exceptional of circumstances. And I'll be happy to detail, the technical aspects of how IIIT would work, in the Q&A session. And so in conclusion, I've sought to put forth a theory regarding the grounds of Islamic law. In a world where Islamic law is often the subject of headlines, understanding the framework through which this law operates, achieves legitimacy is a crucial endeavor. My theory, which I call Islamic law's integrity, takes seriously Dworkin's perspective of the law as a constantly interpretive endeavor. Like Dworkin, I believe that even straightforward rules require interpretation. That Islamic law is fundamentally interpretive is evidenced by the voluminous legal literature on every topic imaginable, including many that are highly obscure. This is notwithstanding the fact that ijma is traditionally considered one of the main sources of Islamic law. In practice, the number of items on which there are true juristic consensus are very few, and those are also based on an interpretive exercise. I posit that Islamic legal reformists are mistaken in conceptualizing Islamic law as an objectives-based and public interest-based system. Instead, I argue that Islamic law must be viewed in Dworkinian terms of the best constructive interpretation of principles of justice, fairness, and procedural due process, but with the added caveat that God must be taken into account as a source of moral authority. Such a theory of the law counters the tendency to privilege modern norms of morality